And welcome to the low clarinet ATSSB clinic. And I thought I would start by playing the slow etude for you. I've got remarks, and I thought that I would first play, and then we'll kind of backtrack and kind of look at what's really there and what problems you need to address and be cognizant of when you're working up the music. So I'll do number 21, F major. Excuse, there was an errant F sharp in there, I think, somewhere, but it wasn't there. But I'm sure if you heard it, you know where it was. This etude, I think, is in some respects poses a little bit more of a challenge than a harder etude, because a lot of students would look at this and say, well, gee, it just starts out with concert E-flat scales, you know, 3 notes to the beat. And it looks pretty innocent and pretty easy. But one of the dangers with this etude is that you have a long time to look at it and a long time to live with it before the audition. And what can happen with an etude like this is you can get really stale, because there are only so many different ways you can practice this before you get bored with it. So in my comments, one of my suggestions was to try it slower for a while at 60. And, you know, maybe just slowing yourself down for a period of time will give you a chance to listen to things. And one of the things you can work on is I've put brackets in the music where you can keep the right hand down. And I'm a really firm believer in doing that, especially since this is the size of my hand, playing bass clarinet, and I don't want to, you know, have even a chance that I would flip a finger. So if I could put fingers down on the right hand ahead of when they're needed, then I'm going to do that. And you can see where the brackets are. Sometimes it would be the entire right hand, and sometimes it would only be 3 fingers without the pinky, because that wouldn't be needed. But if you were going slowly, then you could take things in the brackets and go. And things like that, and just work on getting things smooth at a slow tempo. And then kind of plugging them back in and doing it. And especially down near the bottom, it modulates, and you go to A minor and D minor and C major, and so there's a chance there to work on those fingering combinations too. And I'm talking about probably, let's say, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, starting with the 7th line, or even the 6th line. You've got those scales going up and going down, and you can work at a slow speed, making sure that they're really smooth. When I copied the etude, I noticed that there was a typographical error in the 2nd line, and apparently all the books that are published by Southern Music, they forgot the rests in the 2nd line there. So it just, you had your B2 dotted quarter note, and then there was nothing on B3, so I just added them. So be aware, because a lot of times the band directors just kind of churn everything out and copy it out, and I'm not even sure if it's correct online. I haven't looked. But let's see, what else? Also, I put a dotted line right before the end of the etude down there, and it's kind of where you could take a catch breath just to finish. It's better to be safe than sorry, and if there's any possibility that you think you're going to run out of air, then it's a good idea to just squeeze a breath in there. And of course, you probably notice, students, that when you practice with the metronome, you don't get as much time for a breath as you do when you're playing it without the metronome. Because you have a little sneak room there. You've got that extra little millisecond to squeeze a breath in, but you can practice that too. So if you plan to take that little catch breath at the end, you can practice trying to be as unobtrusive as possible with that breath. So. Another thing that you can work on is the voicing of the upper notes, and of course this may pertain to how good an instrument you have at your disposal. Sometimes if the instrument's not in good shape or the reed or the mouthpiece aren't good setups, it's really hard to get a resonant tone quality all through the registers. So I know that a lot of times you can't do anything about it if you're stuck with a poor instrument, but if it's an instrument that's out of adjustment, I'm sure your band directors would want to know that. So the first time, or if you even have an instrument now that you have access to, if there's anything that you know is not adjusted correctly, I would get that taken care of right away, because that can lead to a lot of other issues, and you don't want to go there if you don't have to. So, does anybody have any questions about this first etude, what you could do with it, how you could practice it?
Are there any spots you recommend crescendoing?
Well, the longer scale passages, starting on the 6th line, I think when you do that, you can kind of do a little bit of a crescendo, but you just need to be careful that it doesn't sound like you can't get the notes out. You know, you want it to flow, and there's a difference between making a graceful crescendo and having it sound like somebody's sticking a knife in it, you know? So you just have to be careful, and you have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the judges. And I mean, they're listening, they're all ears, they have nothing to look at, they're behind a screen, so what are they going to hear? And what do you want them to hear? So you have to think about that aspect of it. And anybody you can get to listen is a good idea, you know, especially one of your band directors, maybe early on, before you get too far down the line and maybe, you know, have something that's starting to be ingrained. And I recommend slow practice and try different kinds of practicing. I know a lot of times students love to start at the beginning of an etude and just play the whole thing through from the beginning to the end, but that will breed staleness. So again, my recommendation would be to start in different spots. You know, maybe live with it for a while, starting at the beginning, and then go down and maybe start on the 6th line and focus on the last 4 lines, because I'm sure you've heard people that it's very obvious that they've done nothing but start at the beginning and practice to the end. And the beginning is gangbusters, and by the time they get to the end, there are all sorts of things building into it. And they no longer seem to be playing as fluently or as confidently. So I would recommend that too. Okay, yes?
Do you place any emphasis on the first or the grouping of 3 notes when you practice? And if you do you carry that forward to performance?
I think it kind of inhibits the flow of the thing. I don't think I did. Maybe you could detect a little something, but I think it's just supposed to be kind of like rolling water on, you know, in a stream. And you know, and just kind of going and going. And I think it would be a mistake to accentuate anything there, because I think that way it may inhibit you trying to keep everything even. And the other thing, I made my remarks, since you mentioned that, Craig, and asked, the other thing that I made in the written comments was that you want all 3 notes to be pretty well equal. So you don't want to get into something where you're clipping accidentally the 3rd note under the slur. So you don't want to go that does not sound smooth, even though it might be well played. You want so you want it nice and smooth, and you want kind of a lilt to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, and 2, and 3. Okay? All right, and the next one is the one that I'm sure that everyone will be putting all their eggs into this basket, because there's a lot here. First of all, it's in B minor, and uses melodic minor for those of you that have had theory training. So you're going to see G sharps and A sharps, but then sometimes going back to A natural and G natural. The register is not particularly friendly down on about the 3rd line or the 4th line from the bottom. And what I've done is I've put some markings on the music. And I certainly would start out, I think, with this playing really very slowly so you hear every note, and get it perfect at a slow speed. Because it won't happen later. If you try to put the cart before the horse and you try to get the speed first, you either won't hear that you've built things in, or they'll just, you know, happen of their own accord. So you're going to want to start out going. And just make kind of a melodic etude out of it. And make it pretty, and make sure everything's there. Check your fingerings. So when you work it up, as you get faster and faster, it needs to get lighter and lighter. Well. That's a long one, and that's what I had some ideas when I started working on it. And of course, I'm older than you are. Some of you might be able to make that in a breath, and if you work on it long enough and you know you can make it in a breath, you might not need those numbers. But one possibility is to use all the number ones. And so if you start at the beginning, there are no number ones. It's a four-measure phrase. The second is a four-measure phrase, and then you get into one. Let's say I think it's 12 measures there. So I put some number twos there for people who can't make it. But again, you have to practice how you're going to squeeze that in, because you're going to have to do it without, halting the music. I know one thing that I don't like to hear when I'm a judge is people stopping the music and having an empty beat while they breathe. So you got to figure out how to do it. So on the second line, if you're going to use that number two, so you do it as quickly as possible. You practice, as soon as you're able to get some speed, just, getting whatever air you can get in. Usually whatever you can gasp will be enough. And then I put a 1 and a 2 because even I don't need the number twos, but I needed the number 1 on the third line, sort of. And sometimes I'm fine and sometimes I'm not, depending on the atmosphere and reeds and all sorts of other variables. I usually can make it to the end, but sometimes I like to be safe. I don't think I took a breath when I just played it for you, but it's a possibility. But you got to be quick. And then the other problem is that if you're going to breathe there on the third line, the next note is a D. That is not a friendly note for either contrabass, right? Am I speaking the truth? Yeah, contrabass or bass clarinet, that is not a nice note there usually. And if you can train yourself where you don't need the breath, you might decide you don't want it there. So, and then we go to the fourth line, and I put a number 2 after the 4 measures. And then you could go 4 more. And I've got a 1 and a 2 there. I had a little trouble making that one to the end, and the rest isn't very long. There's not a long time to fuel up. So I put a 1 and a 2. So even if you're a pretty good player, you might want to take that breath. And then when we go down to the next line, I have a 1 and a 2 right before the F sharp. That's not a very nice note either, but you have to practice breathing and voicing them. So I put 2 number 2s, one in the measure before and one under the number 1. You can decide. If you can make it, you might want to go there because there's just nowhere to breathe. When you get 3 lines from the bottom, that's a descending little sequence, and you really have to play all of that without a breath. Or it kind of raises the judge's antennae, and then they're listening for that kind of thing. And what if somebody comes along who isn't breathing and does everything else that you're doing? You might be having a problem with points from judges there. So I would work, you can take that out of context and just work on going down the scale and, trying to make the breathing. I took a breath where the number 2 was on the last line because I just wanted to be a little safer than sorrier. And I got to thinking about that. If I were writing my markings above the music today, I think I'd probably put a number 1 above the number 2 because that's a long way to go. I put some markings with fingerings in. There are 2 A sharps, one on the second line. That's one of the A sharp passages, the low A sharp, and then there's another one 3 lines from the bottom. I would use the chromatic fingering. You all know that, right? So first finger and fingernail key. But the one on the second line, you may decide you're better off not having to change them out. You may like just switching out middle and first. Hang on. or you can go ahead and use the chromatic. It just depends. But whatever you do, you don't want to have a finger flip. That's the main thing. I put some rights and some lefts in there. I'm sure that you've all probably had compadres in your bass clarinet and your contra sections that don't know what the keys on each side are supposed to do. And so they end up in an etude like this, where they have to go from B to C sharp. They end up reaching too far to go for things because they don't know how to do it on the other side. So the first thing is get all your key work worked out and figure out what's what. And I generally go to the nearest thing first. There might be an occasional exception, but generally I'll go to the right side first because it's easier if you're doing your right hand to depress something with your right pinky than it is to cross way over and reach way out like this. And that's asking for finger flips too. So that's kind of the thinking behind my markings there. And I certainly would try both ways. If you're doing something different than what I marked, I would try my markings and give them equal time before you make a decision. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll think I'm going to do it one way and make my decision, and I end up changing my mind. So it can happen as you start working and you start thinking and you go, you know what, I think I'm better off doing it the other way. And there's nothing wrong with changing your mind as you tweak it and as you get into it. Does anybody have any questions about that etude?
Are there any mistakes in this one?
No mistakes. No. This one, boy, I'd hate to be behind a contra doing that. That's going to be, you know, I think bass clarinetists and alto clarinetists will be able to get more speed on it. But contra is going to be a little tough, you know, and you're going to have exactly the right reed and ligature and mouthpiece setup, and you're going to have to practice higher notes and kind of voice everything, and it's going to be a little tough. So I put a lot of comments there about things that I've found that'll work as far as good setups and good mouthpieces, good reeds. One contra mouthpiece that I've found that works out quite well is Clark Forbes is making one. All right, all right. And I don't know, are they making the optimum ligatures now for contra? Oh, you have a good setup, that's good. So you probably got the best possible setup for getting everything. That's excellent. So.
For anybody who's not familiar with Dr. Bouncy, stuff is very affordable and it manages the air very, very well.
And like if you don't want the higher quality, they have student mouthpieces that are even more affordable and fast.
Yeah, the debut mouthpiece.
For less money than you'll pay us, they'll use it off the right.
Yeah, they have some good mouthpieces, and Clark Forbes has just recently gotten into the contra mouthpiece thing. And I made some remarks about care for instruments, and I'll bet you're all smiling, and I'm sure you're the ones who take a really good care of it. I'm sure your band directors just love you. But sometimes it's really, you'll get an instrument and you can tell it has had a hard life before you. So, you know, I know that you'll take care of them, but there's some good ideas there for maybe you can prevail upon some of your colleagues in your ensembles to take good care of everything so it'll work. So, if there are no further questions, yes, Craig?
What is the warm-up allowance? Let's say that you're number 8 and you haven't warmed up since they started. Did you get some sort of warm-up time before you begin to play 2 or 3 notes or something?
My husband could answer that because he presides over all that as region chairman.
Every 5 people auditioning, there'll be a warm-up for everyone, and when it's your turn, you can play anything you want in one breath. So it's your warm-up of choice as long as it's within one breath, and then that's it.
Yeah, I would say, I'm Craig Daniel, I'm a friend of Nancy's. we played together a lot. I would say if you're at the end of that grouping of 5, take advantage for sure of the warm-up time, and make sure, especially if you're in a cold room like this, you'll get some condensation. Your warm breath air in that cold neck will cause condensation. Make sure you empty that out by turning the instrument upside down, get the water out of there, because you'll blow it down into the keys and sometimes even get a gurgling sound. So take advantage of the warm-up, get the water out of your horn.
Well, I have a solution for that. This is made by the BG company, and they're washable chamois pad dryers. And this is, I've forgotten whether I got bass clarinet, tenor saxophone, whatever, but this is big enough. And what I did before you all came in, it's very cold in here. And I took everything apart and swabbed it out with a silk swab, and I have water in my A and my G sharp keys, so I blotted it with this. And if it gets a little bit gamey, then you can wash it with soap and water. So
What is that called again?
it's called a pad dryer.
And it's made by the BG company?
BG, yeah, and it's made out of chamois. So, okay, thank you very much. I appreciate all of you coming. Thank you. It's my pleasure. Good luck. Good luck. Okay. Good luck.